Let me give you the Cliff Notes version of my next guest credential list. He served as an officer in the Marine Corps, a combat diver, a military freefall parachutist, and is a graduate of the U.S. Army Ranger School. From there, he continued to serve his country in the FBI, serving as FBI liaison to the U.S. Capitol Police, investigating threats on high-level government officials. But he wasn't done yet. Post 9/11, he began an assignment to the Counterterrorism Division of the FBI's Washington Field Office, developing an expertise in the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic doctrine, the global Islamic movement, and terrorist organizations including Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and others. In 2006, Mr. Guandolo was designated a subject matter expert by FBI headquarters and created and implemented the FBI's first counterterrorism training program focused on the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic doctrine, and the global Islamic movement. While in the FBI, he also received 2 United States Attorney's Awards for investigative excellence. He served on the FBI's Washington Field Office SWAT team for over 9 years and its senior team leader for 3 of those years. Currently, Mr. Guandolo advises governments, the United States, and others on matters related to national security, specifically the threat from the global Islamic movement. He actively briefs and teaches members of Congress, senior military officials, police, the intelligence community, key community leaders, and others. He's also the author of 3 books, which focus primarily on the threat of Islamic extremism here and abroad. So to say my next guest knows a thing or two about a thing or two is the understatement of the year. Joining me now is the man with all the accolades and the founder of Understanding the Threat, and my personal friend from all the way back in my One America days, John Guandolo. John, it is so great to be reunited with you.
It's great to be on with you, Tommy. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Listen, I know you're an expert in damn near everything. So I have a lot of things to ask, but I want to start because we are looking back a year later after that disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And to let you know my top line thoughts on it, I think we needed to get the heck out. We didn't need to get the heck out like that. Our commander-in-chief failed dismally, in my opinion. But I want to know what you thought about all that and looking back a year after.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share on this. I think my opinion today is the same as it was when America left Afghanistan in the way we did. I wrote about it, spoke about it at the time, and very little has really changed in my mind. And that is, number one, here we are in the summer of 2022, and the U.S. government still has not identified the threats that attacked us on 9/11. We identify groups, we identify individuals, but we don't actually look at the entire threat that we're dealing with in Africa, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, elsewhere, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan. We're not looking at it from a strategic perspective, number one. Number two, I agree with you. I don't think you should continue fighting a war and sacrificing American blood and treasure when you haven't identified who the enemy is. Our policy going back to right after 9/11 reflects no understanding of the threat and no desire to deal with the way the threat manifests, that same threat, the global Islamic movement here in the United States. And it's much more dangerous here inside the continental United States and within all 50 states, even than it was in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I think I'm glad we brought our troops home. Now, of course, the way we did it and what was revealed about our general officers should be shocking to most Americans, which is, we had general officers, 3- and 4-star generals, telling us that the Taliban was our security,
right,
and we could trust them in Afghanistan. That's not only stupid and foolish, it's criminally negligent. And I think the blood of the people that were killed over there, especially during our withdrawal, are directly on the combatant commanders that were in charge.
Another thing that really disturbed me when all this was happening, and there were a lot of Republicans were screaming this from the rooftops a year ago to bring over all of these refugees from Afghanistan. And I said, wait a second, if I'm familiar at all with our vetting process under the Biden administration at our southern border, it doesn't go well. So bringing over all these people that we don't know really who they are, why they want to come here, and resettling them in the United States, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Not because I didn't want to help people, but because I've had a lot of lessons from people like you and others that say, listen, you have to be careful when you're bringing people over from the Middle East. You don't know what their intentions are, and we have a right to know that. Did that bother you? I'm sure it did, but I want your insight on it.
Absolutely. First of all, let's just in a vacuum, let's look at this. You cannot vet Afghanis. They cannot be vetted. There is no infrastructure to do it. So that's the first thing. Most people who live in Afghanistan do not know their own birth dates. And so the idea that we're somehow going to vet them is just nonsense. So that's number one. Number two, and I'll go back several months ago, we were briefing a governor, and we put together this briefing booklet, and he had asked me to come in and speak about the vetting because they had, thousands of refugees from Afghanistan, and I'll use refugees in quotes because they don't meet the legal definition of refugee, but let's not let the law get in the way and the international definition of a refugee get in the way of a good story. But I showed him, let's look at some people that we vetted. Abdurrahman al-Amoudi was the Islamic advisor to President Clinton and Vice President Gore for their terms in office. And he was an al-Qaeda financier who was sentenced to 23 years in prison in 2003. So that's who he is. And he got vetted by the Secret Service and the FBI. Gulmurad Kalimov was an ISIS commander who was trained by the State Department 5 times in weapons and tactics, including training inside the United States. And when this was brought to the attention of the State Department, they literally defended themselves saying, hey, we vetted him, so it's not our fault. Well, obviously your vetting system sucks because you let an ISIS commander get trained by the State Department. And the examples of this are endless inside our system. Mr. Biden just made Mohammed Majid a commissioner on the International Commission for Religious Freedom. Mohammed Majid was the vice president and the president of the Islamic Society of North America, which the Department of Justice identified the Islamic Society of North America in the largest terrorism financing trial in American history, which was adjudicated in Dallas, Texas, 2008, Holy Land Foundation trial. ISNA is identified as a Muslim Brotherhood organization that sent money directly to Hamas leaders and organizations overseas. And so our ability to vet easily identifiable jihadis, terrorists, is zero. We can't tell friend from foe. So trying to vet, and again, I'll put that in air quotes, refugees, again in air quotes, from Afghanistan, it's a non-starter.
I want to move on to news that broke last week that's really turned the world upside down, and that was the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago. Now, I know that you proudly served in the FBI. I know that you work with many people that were in the FBI, still are in the FBI, and there's been a lot of commentary about those on the Trump side threatening those in the FBI or talking about federal law enforcement and putting them in a bad light. And of course, we don't condone any threats of violence or any behavior like that. But what do you think happened there? And do you think those agents acted appropriately? And even though it was, of course, Merrick Garland and others, do they hold some responsibility for what happened? And in your eyes, was it justified what they did?
Right. Well, so this is really peeling back the layers of an onion here, but straight to the point. When you look at who's driving this train, there has now been I'm just going to say for purposes of this discussion, a 6 to 7 year, very clear history and decades worth of examples, but in the last 6 to 7 years, where we know the people behind this in this administration have a long history of absolutely lying for the sole purpose of gaining control of the state and power. That's what this is all about. The entire, quote, Russia collusion with Mr. Trump, we now know, and you've talked about it quite eloquently over the years, that was not only a lie. We know that all kinds of people on that side were lying in public and then testifying privately the exact opposite of what they were saying publicly because they didn't want to go to jail for perjury because they knew the truth, but they publicly were saying there's Russian collusion. We got all this evidence, and there is no evidence. As a matter of fact, if anybody's colluding with our adversaries, it was Mrs. Clinton and members of the Democratic leadership and others. So you have that. You've got the entire multiple year assault on American cities by the Chinese communist organization Black Lives Matter, the communist organization Antifa, and other communist entities like Democratic Socialist America, Communist Party USA, and many others working in conjunction at the ground level with Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and others. And nothing done there. When people literally were assassinated, I don't know the total price tag, but hundreds of millions, if not more, dollars of damage. And I know that number was rising rapidly. I haven't seen the final numbers, and yet no response.
But John,
at the federal level,
when we look at what happened, and I want to get your perspective as someone who was in the FBI, because what they're saying is, listen, he had documents. They tried to say that he had nuclear codes that they needed to get a hold of. It was classified information, maybe something for the National Archives. In your experience and your work at the FBI, was that standard operating procedure and standard protocol to raid a former president's home looking for that kind of material and then also keep his attorney out in the parking lot from observing what happened? Is that standard procedure of what the FBI did when you were serving in that agency?
No, it is not. And what I think is important to keep, what's important to keep in mind is this has never happened in American history, where you have literally the FBI agents going to Mar-a-Lago, meeting with Mr. Trump, or at least his representatives, looking at where these things were stored, how they were stored, talking about it. And then instead of coming back in the same relational way and saying, hey, here are the concerns we have, do this, DOJ attorney to your attorney. They conduct a raid the way they did. And based on what is being reported and how the search was conducted, no, this looks like political intimidation. It looks to me like the kind of stuff that you would expect in a Stalinist regime. And I think based on what we know is factual and evidentiary, again, over the last 6 years of what these folks have done, this is just that. Now, to look forward, I would say what I would expect them to do is, number one, I would expect, as I wrote about this not too long ago and mentioned it in another interview, I would not be surprised if in the next 90 days there was some legal action, criminal legal action taken against Hunter Biden. And again, then that would give them the facade of being able to say, you see, we're judicious, when in fact, we've seen this coming for a while. I think there's no getting around the amount of evidence against Hunter Biden is so great. Now, of course, it was very significant against Mrs. Clinton, and she was never indicted, and others at high government level. But that being said, I think you will see that, and that'll probably allow them to do other things. And I think we'll see a transition of power at the highest levels of government following that, in order to allow them to maintain power, because I think they realize Mr. Biden either is unelectable or won't make it. So that's that. And the last thing I want to say about this, Tommy, is I want your viewers to really hear this. James Comey admitted when he was leaving his position as the U.S. attorney in New York City, Southern District of New York, he gave an interview in 2003 to New York Magazine where he said, and I quote, "I was a communist." And then, to paraphrase, not sure where I am politically right now. Now, in a world where the federal government functions, they would have put the brakes on right there and said, well, we're not sure you should go to your next place, which he was already named to be the next number 2 of the Department of Justice, the Deputy Attorney General. He certainly, if we had a functioning federal government, would have never been elevated to the position of FBI director. I share this with your viewers so they understand the fact that a guy like that was elevated, a guy who admitted he was a communist, gets elevated to the FBI director. That doesn't happen if you have a government that's not corrupt. This government is corrupted. The bureaucracy is completely corrupted. And the key components of the federal government are being controlled by adversaries of the Republic and liberty. And that's really important, I believe, for your viewers to understand.
Well, there's so much to peel back here, and there's so much that the average American watches and listens to, and they don't understand it. But we know that there's been an attempt to take down Trump since he came down the escalator, maybe even prior to that, as soon as he became a Republican and he posed a threat. But I do want to ask you about January 6th, because this kind of all comes together. When you look at the raid, I think that they wanted the January 6th hearing to be their kill shot into Donald Trump. Of course, it wasn't that. But looking back at January 6th, I know that you have some experience with that, and you can have some insight you can share with us about what actually happened that day and how you saw it from your perspective.
Yes. So I was in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. I was actually there. I wasn't going to go, but a pastor in Dallas invited me, and Michelle Bachmann, who's on our board at Understanding the Threat, was going to be there. And it was set up by people that I used to work with in Washington, D.C., really good folks. And they set up this basically a permitted space right on the grass, right in front of the Capitol, to pray and to really unite in prayer for the nation and for peace. And so I went, and I thought it was great. And I did some, live streaming from there and did a video and put that out. And next thing I know, the first time I had to fly after that, besides the fact on social media, of course, I was lumped in with falsely, people making all kinds of accusations just because I was in Washington, D.C. And starting in February, when I flew from Dallas to North Carolina, I got stopped. And now I'm still a sworn deputy. I'm an auxiliary deputy in Virginia. And I was traveling, and I got the full TSA mantra, the complete search of all my stuff, me personally, patted down everything. And I just thought, okay, maybe it's a, one-time deal. 100% of my flights from that time until 2 weeks ago have been that way. So I normally have to leave 3+ hours when I traveled, because it normally took me 90 minutes to 2 hours to get through security. And there was a period of about 3 months, about April, May, and June of this year, where every gate that I went to, TSA would set up security, and they would do spot checks on everyone. And yet 100% of the time I got chosen. And then I made a video, a flight I was on about 6 weeks ago. And, the lady from TSA, the supervisor, told me it was random. I'm like, really random? I just counted 100 people walked by. You stopped 4, and I'm one of the 4. Again, does that sound random? It's 100% of the time. It's not random. And then, of course, a few weeks ago, I got interviewed finally by the FBI. And of course, they wanted to make sure I'm not some sort of a violent extremist or calling for the overthrow of the United States government, which is absurd. That's that. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, after now that I've been interviewed, and they apparently, or at least trying to give me the impression they're not looking at me anymore, I can flew for the first time without being molested by TSA. But this is the world we live in, and this is. I think this is just the beginning. And the fact that they can do this to Mr. Trump should make every American pause about what they can do to anybody who speaks truth about our Constitution, about our founding principles, and about our authority as citizens in this country.
But from your perspective, you obviously weren't involved in any of the busing into the Capitol or anything like that. But being there that day, did anything seem amiss to you as far as how they had secured that, how well they had secured it, anybody that was being let in? I mean, there's a lot of stories out there, and a lot of it's passed off as conspiracy. But with everything going on, it's hard to know what really happened.
Yeah, that's a great question, Tommy. I spent a good portion of the day with a friend of mine who's still active in the FBI, and we met another friend of ours in the FBI, spent a lot of the time with them. And as we were standing next to each other watching, we literally, like, guys would walk by us. We're like, there's Antifa, there's Antifa, there's Antifa. And at one point, and I've never seen this mentioned by the media, a Red Star cluster, like a military Red Star cluster, went up right over where we were. Somebody fired it, and we looked at each other because this FBI agent I was with is also a Marine. And we said, I'm not sure what's going to happen right now, but nothing good. And so there was a lot going on that didn't look right. And when you now look at the facts, you have people, we watched as people walked up the steps of the Capitol, talked to Capitol police officers. The officers stepped aside and waved them up the steps. Guys, and I saw this myself and I filmed it, but there's plenty of footage of it out there. Then Capitol Police at the top of the steps, who literally either opened the door or stepped back and like waved the guys in, and they went in. And now we're saying that's some kind of act of insurrection. Well, you can't have a true armed insurrection if people aren't armed. So legally speaking, this is nonsense. This is a color revolution. And actually, Chris Burgard was in South America, Central America, when in Honduras for the color revolution there, and filmed that and compared what he saw on January 6th with that. I think Capital Punishment is a great film, and I would encourage people to watch it because it's powerful. But it's exactly what you say, and the fact that nobody has been charged with sedition, treason, insurrection in any of these cases, but they've been charged with trespassing, misdemeanor, property destruction, things like that. This is asinine. This is craziness, but it's dangerous.
There's so much more I want to talk to you about, but I'm going to have to wait until you're in Nashville. I know that you got to run, but thank you for giving us all that information. And I would encourage everyone to check out Understanding the Threat. I've been following you guys for years. A lot of important information about the threats that we face. And like you say, truly understanding them, because it's not enough just to read about them or hear about them on the news. It's actually a deep understanding of what's going on. So, John, always appreciate seeing you, and thank you so much.
Thank you. And I encourage people, go to understandthreat.com to learn more. But thanks as always for having me.
Thanks so much, John. All right, don't forget, guys, our show streams on Outkick.com. We have all the exclusive content, articles, and special footage there, so make sure that you're streaming us on Outkick.com. But up next, in a primary that shocked absolutely no one, Wyoming broke up with our favorite rhino, Liz Cheney, and I have some final thoughts.